Hello and welcome to this episode of The Language I Love Is, the podcast that's all about languages, linguistics, and love. I'm your host, Danny, and today's starring language is a first for the show, a language so old, it's theoretical. This language was the choice of my guest, Yoïn van Spijk, a linguist and expert etymologist who has delighted the internet with his linguistic infographics for many years now. Seeing as his interest covers the whole Germanic family of languages, including English and his native Dutch, it seemed only right that we go straight to the source, to their common prehistoric ancestor, Proto Germanic. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to A Language I Love Is wherever you get your podcasts, and also leaving a rating, review, or comment. Without further ado, let's join Yoïn and dive into all things Germanic. I am extraordinarily delighted to have my guest with me today. This really is a treat for me and for you, dear listener, because my guest today is Yoïn van Spijk. Yoïn is a linguist. He's also a teacher of Dutch in the Netherlands, Dutch as a second language to many students. He's a writer for the Dutch linguistic magazine Onze Taal, meaning our language, so it's very, very Dutch and very linguistic. And you may know Yoïn because of his superb linguistic infographics that he puts out onto the internet. This is how I came to know him. These incredibly smart in both senses of the word, these smart infographics about etymology, about the history of English, Germanic languages, great stuff. And he is also a dialectologist as well, so he is suffused in the world of languages and linguistics, and it's just a real pleasure to have him on the podcast today. Yoïn, simply, first off, thank you so much for joining me. And how are you? How are you doing today?
Thank you very much for having me, Danny. And it's a delight to be with you in this episode because my feelings are entirely mutual. We've known each other digitally for some years now. We both love historical linguistics. We love posting things about it. And so I think it's lovely for us to be together today and to talk about what we love.
I completely agree. I think it's so nice that we found each other online, and I think that's wonderful. And I think we have a common mission, which is just to share the stuff that we love. Really, we don't intend to keep all this great information to ourselves. I think, speaking for both of us, it's not only interesting, it's also very useful. We may get onto what I mean by that, but it's just wonderful. And these infographics, if you haven't seen them, do go and find Yoïn's output on Twitter, or the site formerly known as Twitter, and also on Instagram, right? You post there?
I'm on Tumblr, where I always keep my most up-to-date versions of the graphics, because many people often give interesting additions or corrections, and then I update my infographics and put them on Tumblr. And the same version goes to Facebook, Blue Sky, Mastodon, the whole array of Twitter-like websites that there are today.
Yeah, I mean, you are always very gracious and very patient with the people who give you feedback, which perhaps is to be expected because your graphs are huge in their breadth and in their scope. I mean, you manage to condense a lot of information and a lot of languages into a very eye-catching format. These really are super. And you are also on Patreon. People can support you on Patreon financially.
Yes, that's right. I have 2 tiers people can subscribe to. One tier, they get extra articles with some of the infographics. And on the other one, I do something that I really love. I love reconstructing the pronunciation of ancient words, which is actually another branch of historical linguistics. So it's not just making up things that sound historical. But yeah, I reconstruct the pronunciations of the ancient words in my graphics. So Old English, Old Dutch, Latin. So that's the other tier that people can subscribe to. And this is the end of the advertorial.
No, I think it's only fair as well. Like, obviously it's advertising you and your wonderful output, but I really do recommend it to people. As a Patreon supporter myself, I think it's super. Although I was lodging a slight complaint, which is not enough pictures of your two beautiful cats, which would that would be the cherry on top for the linguistics posts. Now, turning away from that, I think it's just super, the language that you've very kindly agreed to come on and talk about today. Please, Yoïn, tell us, what is a language that you love? Introduce it for us.
A language that I love is Proto Germanic. And if we decompose this term, we get two words, proto, which comes from the ancient Greek word protos, which meant first. Now, in this case, it doesn't really mean first, but it means that it is the ancestor of the Germanic languages. And that brings us to the second part, Germanic. Germanic is a term that deserves some explanation.
I could not agree more. I think we really should unpack this. You've given us a very nice brief overview. One thing that we should stress right at the outset, not only because it is relevant, but also because it is, I think, a first for this podcast, this is not a documented language. This is a hypothetical language. I would prefer to say a prehistoric language, because we can be... Like, what are we, 99% certain that Proto-Germanic existed? Like, as hypotheses go, it's a very, very solid one. And this is a first. I think it's great. And I love that you have this incredible focus. You have this incredible interest in Germanic languages, Dutch, German, Swedish, English, Scots, some of which we've had on this podcast before. How on earth can you express your interests for all these languages on the show? Well, by going for the ancestor of all of them, which I think is super. Now, as you very wisely said, I think, to begin with, let's dig into that term Germanic. This language, and therefore its speakers, its linguistic community, they're not crystal clear. They're not, like, we don't have evidence for them. We don't have direct sources. So where on earth do we get this term Germanic?
That's a very interesting question, because it brings us to the Romans, who had all sorts of contacts with the Germanic peoples, good and bad contacts. But the term Germanic, or actually the Latin ancestor of it, Germanus, it was coined by Roman writers to collectively refer to peoples who lived in an area, a large area, stretching from, let's say, Belgium to Poland and the south of Norway. So it was a term that was given by other people. It was not a term used by the Germanic peoples. And I should stress peoples in the plural, because they weren't a nation state. They weren't even a group of people who had a collective consciousness. There weren't a people who had a collective consciousness of being Germanic, or the only thing they shared, as far as we know, is a language. And even this language, the language we are going to talk about today, it was not a standardized language such as classical Latin or the modern day languages such as standard German, but it is believed to have been a group of very closely related, very similar dialects that we now collectively refer to as Proto-Germanic, because it's these dialects that later became the Germanic languages. And a last thing to say about this, something I often see on the internet when I post something about Proto-Germanic, that people confuse Germanic with German. And that's actually a pity. And the cause of this is partly because the term German is a misnomer, because German implicates that it's only the Germans that are Germanic or something like that. So yeah, of course, etymologically, the term German comes from Latin Germanus, but the German language is just only one of the many, many Germanic languages. And it's not the Germanic language or the original Germanic language. It's just one of the sisters in a very big household.
I like that. Two of those sisters they're including the language that we're speaking right now, which is English, of course, and also your native Dutch, which is another Germanic language on the other side of the North Sea. I think that's a really, really nice introduction because we should enjoy this field. We should love the study of Proto-Germanic and the Germanic languages, but we should also tread carefully. I think there is might I say, like a darker side to this topic, in that there's a long-standing interest in Germanic people, and especially in infusing all of this into one sort of special, powerful people, a very kind of homogenous people who existed in a point of time. This was utilized, weaponized, I could say, over the course of the 20th century and continues to be today. I think, personally, the study of these peoples, their identity, how they saw the world, their religion, their culture is absolutely fascinating, but we're going to be talking about just the language today. I think that's enough for us to be getting on with. With all that as a good and necessary preface to our discussion, let's get into the specifics. When do we think that people spoke Proto-Germanic?
The estimates vary, but I think we would be safe to say it was spoken between 500 BC and the start of the Common Era. What we call Proto-Germanic is the language that started when certain sound changes happened after Proto-Indo-European, the language it is thought to descend from, which also gave Latin, ancient Greek, the Slavic languages, Sanskrit, Hindi, the Celtic languages. We could go on and on. Proto-Germanic itself was a sister of these languages, so it was a daughter of Proto-Indo-European, and we start the Proto-Germanic era when certain sound changes happened, which we'll discuss later on. It ended when the Germanic languages grew apart so much that we can speak of daughter languages. Now, of course, this is always a very tricky part because languages don't have a fixed starting date and a fixed ending date. It's not like from one day to another people start speaking Middle English after having spoken Old English. It's even not the case that a grandfather spoke Old English and his grandson or granddaughter spoke Middle English. It's always a very fluid thing, and we like to put labels on things. We like to put things in boxes, in well-defined boxes. The same goes for Proto-Germanic. It was a fluid thing, and around the 1st century AD, we start to speak about the daughter branches, North Germanic, East Germanic, West Germanic, the branch English and Dutch and German are part of, while North Germanic is, of course, the branch of Danish, Swedish, Icelandic. So the end of Proto-Germanic is when these branches started to grow apart so much that we can't speak of one group of dialects anymore.
Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, that diversity was there for a long time. Extraordinarily gradual process, but also no doubt a process that was sped up as peoples migrated. So, for example, in the late Roman period, we have lots of evidence for the migration, these very impressive migrations of Germanic-speaking peoples into the borders of the old Roman Empire. So, if you like your Roman history, you'll have heard of the Visigoths and the Vandals and the Burgundians, and these people were speaking Germanic languages. I think it's fair to say languages by this point, yes. Probably very diverse, although we have really not much evidence for a lot of these languages, with the exception of Gothic. We've got loads and loads of good stuff for Gothic. Hence why Gothic is kind of like the darling of Germanic linguistics. It's the oldest Germanic language that we have lots of evidence for. It's very old, it's very useful, it's very interesting. However, back to Proto-Germanic. I mentioned those migrations. Migrations imply people and their languages are moving over large distances. Where are they moving from? Like, where was the homeland, if we can talk about it, for Proto-Germanic?
The archaeological evidence points to the north of Western Europe, let's say northern Germany, northern Poland, Denmark, and the south of Scandinavia. That's where we find, and I'm not an archaeologist, I should stress that, but that's where we find the artifacts that we can connect to these peoples. So yeah, we think that it's that's a rough estimation of the area where Proto-Germanic was spoken. But as you said, it moved with the people speaking it. And when people come to live apart, they start to speak in a different way. Because if you don't speak to the people anymore that live 1,000 kilometers in the east direction or in the west, you start to develop your own habits of speaking, your own accent, your own words. And as we all know, back in the day, traveling was not so much of a thing as much done as now. You couldn't take an airplane to your Western Germanic or Eastern Germanic neighbors. So there were forests, there were rivers, there were mountains. People lived in small communities. So these dialects of Proto-Germanic started to grow apart, and they have kept doing so for the last 2 millennia.
Absolutely, yes. And I find that so fascinating. I often talk about historical linguistics as it can be like doing archaeology without getting your hands dirty. It can be so interesting to dig into. We can kind of, the fact that we can tell where these languages were spoken, people that we basically have no evidence otherwise for these people, the fact that we can tell that, probably in the rough Baltic region, and then they migrated purely through words. I mean, that's why I do this thing. I think that's why you do this thing too. That feeling is just, absolutely fascinating. And indeed as well, we should say, yes, as you correctly say, these are probably quite small groups of people divided by geography, but nonetheless very much in contact. Proto-Germanic, we can tell from, again, just from the words, is getting words from other languages outside, and it's also giving words to other languages in a sort of chain across Europe, in particular words heading in a sort of vaguely eastward direction. I'm sat here in the Czech Republic right now. The language is Czech. There is a very old layer in Czech as a Slavic language that comes from Germanic. If I can go to the local shop and order some chleb, for example, which is a loaf of bread, this is the word loaf. And Czech actually preserves the ch that has been lost from the Germanic word. Awesome stuff. I love all of this stuff. But really, a point that we should clarify, well, I'll phrase it as a question. Do we really have no sources for Proto-Germanic? Or, our archaeological record goes back pretty far. So is there anything that gets us pretty close to the Proto-language?
Yes, there are candidates for inscriptions that may be Proto-Germanic. For example, we have the Negau helmets, and on one of these helmets, helmet B, which is from the 4th century BC, we find an inscription in an alphabet that is very close to runes. And one of the readings, the most popular reading today, is Harigasti Tewa, and it may be translated with Harigast, a name, literally army guest. Harigast, the divine. So Harigasti Tewa, and Tewa is the word for divine, which we'll further look into later because it has some interesting features. It may be the Germanic counterpart to Latin Deus, the word for God. I must add that this reading is still debated. There are multiple readings, but yes, it may be one of the first instances of written evidence of Proto-Germanic. It was found in the Alpine region, if I'm not mistaken, a region which was in contact with the Germanic peoples. So yeah, this is one of the possible direct evidences of the Germanic language. We also have indirect evidence from Latin. As I said, the Germanic peoples came into contact with the Romans, and the Romans transcribed some of their names. This also gives us a window into their language, and we can delve into that later. Absolutely.
Yes, I love that. The Romans are writing about their battles against these people. I mean, it's not a friendly relationship, but they are accidentally recording a lot of very, very helpful words for us. I mean, to draw another comparison, we've got, I mentioned that I'm sat here in the Czech Republic. I'm specifically in Bohemia, which is a Latin name that the Romans got from the people of this region before they were Slavic speaking, when they were still Germanic speaking. I think most people tend to agree that the heme of Bohemia is home. It's Heim or something like that. So the Romans are, they may not be getting on with these Germanic speakers, but they are certainly in the good books of historical linguistics today. Great stuff. Now, you mentioned things like the Negau helmet. Like, it's a good candidate, but really, these very, very short and very, very old inscriptions, they're not our best evidence for Proto-Germanic. How do we really get back to this language?
We get back to this language by means of reconstruction, which means we, and I say we, but the reconstructions that were done by brilliant people. I'm not one of the people who reconstructed Proto-Germanic. I like reading about it and thinking about it, of course. But people reconstructed the Proto-Germanic language using the comparative method, which means they compared the sounds, the words, the grammar, the syntax of the earliest daughter languages. So you mentioned Gothic. The earliest Germanic daughter language we have a lot of written evidence of. We have Proto-Norse, which, unlike its name suggests, is a language that was amply attested in runic inscriptions. We also use Old English, Old High German, Old Saxon, Old Dutch, and work back to a common base. So we compare the words and then think about which word could be the base of all of these words. This involves the branch of historical phonology, historical sound change, because it involves looking at how sounds change over time and how they can regularly become other sounds. My favorite word to reconstruct is the word for stone, because it nicely reflects how the vowels changed and what happened with some endings. Because just like Latin, Proto-Germanic was a highly inflected language. It is reconstructed with 5 cases, not the same cases as in Latin, but 4 of them are, I should say 6 cases. I always forget the vocative.
Yeah.
But nominative, genitive, dative, all of these fellows are here too. Proto-Germanic was a highly inflected language. It had cases, it had verb conjugation, everything. But the modern languages, they don't, many of them don't show this declension, this noun declension, for example, very clearly. German has some vestiges of it, Icelandic. There are some relics, but these modern languages don't give us the right information. And that's why in reconstructing a proto-language, we always go back to the oldest languages, the first attestations of the language that we can work with. So, for example, if we compare the words for stone in the modern Germanic languages, we have, of course, stone, Frisian steen, Dutch steen, German stein, Swedish steen, if I'm correct. All of these words, they have very different vowels, from O to ear to A, but they don't have any ending at the end of the word. They don't have a case ending. Even German, which still has its cases, just has Stein. But if we go back to the early Germanic languages, such as Gothic and Proto-Norse, we do see an ending. We have Gothic stans with an S in the end. And we have Proto-Norse Steinar with an R-like rune at the end. So these old languages give evidence for an ending. If we compare these words and we work back to a single ancestor, and we also use the information we have from its sister languages, in which words also had endings, such as Latin and ancient Greek, where we have for masculine words us in Latin, such as servus, and ancient Greek os. We arrive at a Proto-Germanic ending az, az. So when we compare all of these Old Germanic words, Old English staan, Old Dutch steen, Old High German stein, Proto-Norse steinar, Gothic stans. And we compare all of these and we go back to one word that could have borne all of these words. We arrive at steinas. So it has this ending which has disappeared from the West Germanic languages and most North Germanic languages. And we have a vowel, a diphthong, I, which can easily become the modern vowels we have. So reconstructing Proto-Germanic is all about comparing the earliest forms of the daughter languages and work back to a single word that could evolve into all of these daughter words. And of course also the grammar, the syntax, the word meanings.
I was going to say, like, this is a language that we have a really good and very well developed idea of, right? This is a language that, I mean, I don't know if people do, but you could attempt to actually learn and to speak. You probably have to make up a few words to make it an everyday language. You know, there's no word for computer or podcast, but, you know, you could fill in the gaps. But yeah, nonetheless, George Walkden, who we had on this very podcast, his whole PhD project was about the syntax or the word order of Proto-Germanic. So not only sounds, not only bits of vocabulary, but actually the strings of vocabulary. So a very, very well developed idea of this language that we've got. And it's not surprising when our historical sources, as everything you've just outlined, can get us back really close, like it's just a little step further back in time to go from things like, for example, Proto-Norse, Old English, Gothic, things like the Negau helmet, and then to just take it that little bit further back. So really then, we've got this very well developed idea of Proto-Germanic, and this is a bit of a strange question, but like, do you think a Dutch speaker, a German speaker, do you think they'd be able to understand it today if we teleported a Proto-Germanic speaker into the middle of Amsterdam? How would they do?
They would do terribly.
Okay. Okay. Right.
I would do terribly. I often give talks about the history of Dutch, and one of my talks involves a Dutch sentence which is then converted into a Middle Dutch sentence. So I translated everything into Middle Dutch, then into Old Dutch, Proto-West Germanic, a daughter branch of Proto-Germanic, and finally Proto-Germanic. What people say is that it comes across very alien. Some people say it sounds like Arabic or Russian. It's, of course, all a matter of associations, which are often very subjective. But yeah, it comes off as very alien, and it's because everything changed a lot. The sounds changed, the words, the grammar, the syntax, and it did so. They did so in every Germanic language. So you can't point to a Germanic language and say, well, that's a very conservative one. It's almost Proto-Germanic. No, there are more than 2,000 years between the modern languages and Proto-Germanic. So yeah, it changed beyond recognition. Yeah,
I think that's very well said. There isn't any Germanic language today that can claim some sort of special status. I mean, people often point to Icelandic as being especially conservative, which some Icelanders might like that status, others might take issue with it, I think for good reason. But nonetheless, like, modern Icelandic is not Proto-Germanic. There's huge differences in vocabulary, grammar, yes, but certainly the sounds. It sounds utterly different to my ears. Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. It's the same idea with Latin. You know, Latin and Proto-Germanic, they're kind of contemporary languages or contemporaries of one another. And really, there's no descendant of Latin today that could claim the same status. You can make your case. I'll hear you out. If you think that Sardinian is, still the language of Cicero and Caesar, it's not. Yeah. Super. Now, I suppose really that there is really one key idea that we should acknowledge, a kind of concept that was pivotal in the development of the Germanic languages as their own family, as their own branch of the wider Indo-European tree. And that idea is, well, the author of that idea will probably be better known to people for things like, Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood as a collator of fairy tales. So, could you please introduce for us the Brothers Grimm? What's their role in this whole story?
Yes, the Brothers Grimm. Jacob Grimm, a German historical linguist, was the first to fully formulate what is now called Grimm's Law. And Grimm's Law means that there are certain historical sound changes, regular sound changes, which means they applied to every word where they could apply. Sound changes that made Proto-Germanic different from not only Proto-Indo-European, but also its sister languages like Latin, Greek, Sanskrit. It gave Proto-Germanic its own character. And these sound changes involve the consonants, and it is often best illustrated by comparing the initial consonants of words. Now, for example, earlier we spoke about Latin deus, the word for God, and the tewa on the Proto-Germanic helmet, or the supposed Proto-Germanic inscription on the helmet. Now, deus and tewa, they differ in various ways, but the most striking difference is in the initial consonant. Deus starts with a d and tewa with a t. Now, this correspondence between Latin initial D and Germanic initial T was noted by several people, but Jacob Grimm was the first to really delve into it. And he found this correspondence in numerous words. For example, if you have English 10, you have Latin deca with a D, or ancient Greek deca. So a Germanic T corresponds to a ancient Greek and Latin D. Or the word tooth corresponds to Latin dens. Or the word two corresponds to Latin duo. Now, in all Germanic languages, except Jacob Grimm's own language, German, which later changed this T sound in a Z, zehn, zahn, zwei, we find this correspondence between a T and a D. Now, this is one of the subsets of Grimm's Law because he found these rules everywhere. For example, where Germanic has an F or a V sound, father, foot, Latin and Greek have a P sound. Pater in Latin, pes for the word for foot, pater in ancient Greek, pos for foot. So we have this correspondence between P in the other languages and Germanic, which went its own way and converted it into an F. And this way we have correspondences for more than 6 consonants, and we consistently find these differences if we compare Germanic to the other Indo-European languages. And this is also the starting point for Germanic, because it's when Germanic underwent these sound changes that we normally say Germanic started, because it's at this point it grew apart from the other languages so much that we can really speak about a different branch in all aspects.
Well, so far you've given us a wealth of information, and I've been able to have a truly geeky conversation about Proto-Germanic. That was excellent, so thank you very much, Yoïn, for that whole language profile. But I think the listeners will want to know a little bit more about you and about why we're talking about this hypothetical language of long ago. So please, in your own words, tell us, what's your story? What's your relationship with Proto-Germanic?
I've come to love Proto-Germanic more and more over the years, and it all started 10 years ago. When I graduated from university as a linguist, I had a basic knowledge of historical linguistics and linguistics in general. But one of the things I wanted to do was document my own native dialect, my own native regional language from the Netherlands, also known as Brabantish, Brabantine, Brabantian. It goes with many names, and especially the variety of my own village where I grew up, Drunen, and the neighborhood. I wanted to write a grammar about these languages because they have different conjugation, different declension, different phonology. Everything is different from standard Dutch. But I wanted to have this. I wanted this grammar to have a historical basis. I wanted to discuss where these changes came from, and of course, you first go back to Middle Dutch. When I was reading about Middle Dutch, I was wondering, where does this come from? Then you go back to Old Dutch, and then I thought, where does Old Dutch come from? And of course, I knew it came from Proto Germanic, but I didn't know much about Proto Germanic. So I started to look up literature about Proto Germanic, for example, a comparative grammar of the early Germanic languages by Fulk, and the etymological dictionary of Proto Germanic by Guus Krone, a fellow Dutchman. And I gradually fell in love with this language because it connected the modern Germanic languages in a very interesting way, because when you look at the modern languages such as English and Dutch, German, Danish, they are so different. It gave me a hard time when I was in high school learning German, learning English, because these languages are so different. And when I learned Latin, I started to make sense of the modern Romance languages. So Latin helped me to learn Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, because I saw where they came from and how they were connected and how Latin changed into each of these languages. It really helped tie these languages and see through them. I wanted the same for the Germanic languages, and we don't have these neat textbooks on Proto-Germanic like we have on Latin. So I started to look into it myself. I looked up the books I just mentioned. I learned about Proto-Germanic, and the more I read about it, the more I loved it. Some parts I can't explain, it's just a feeling. But yeah, it's often when you learn more about something, you come to love it. The same goes for modern languages. I didn't know what Portuguese was until I started to learn it, and now I love it. It's one of my favorite languages. So yeah, learning more about it made me love it a lot.
Well, that's super. You are the perfect guests, and this is the perfect story, because this is a podcast all about loving languages. You don't have to rationalize it. It's just vibes a lot of the time, and I completely understand. I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode a point about practicality. Have you found that now, equipped with this very historical, almost arcane knowledge, that there is actually real world application? At least now you can connect up all the Germanic languages a bit better. Do languages like, let's say, Icelandic or Swedish, are they actually more comprehensible to you now?
Yes, they are. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I understand Icelandic and Swedish now, but when I try to understand them, when I look into their grammar, I don't see the differences with Dutch or German or English. Well, I do see them, but it's not my focus anymore. It's the correspondences with Proto-Germanic, that one language conserved in this particular area and the other language conserved in this particular area. So, for example, the North Germanic languages preserved other things than the West Germanic languages, which I wouldn't recognize if I compared, let's say, Swedish to English. There would only be differences. But now that I know Proto-Germanic, I see the correspondences with that language, and that helps me a lot to better understand these languages, these North Germanic languages, or let's say regional languages in Germany, it helps me to understand them better. So most of all, it has an academic value to me, but also when learning about these languages, it helps me a lot. And I've recently started learning more about Old Norse, because that was a kind of a blind spot for many years. So I've started reading about it, listening to the wonderful videos of the extraordinary Jackson Crawford. And now that I know Proto Germanic, all of this makes a lot more sense, because, I can connect the dots.
Yeah, this knowledge won't bring you instant fluency. We shouldn't oversell it. But nonetheless, you've got this kind of common point of origin. You've got this route into other languages. And it has a psychological value. Everything feels a lot less foreign.
Yes, exactly. And that's what people who read my infographics often also tell me. They can literally connect the dots between these many differences that all eventually derive from one or two words, because also Proto-Germanic also had its variations. But they start to see the patterns.
Now, as regular listeners will know, the third section of every episode is a chance for my guest to introduce a specific feature, a little golden nugget of information that they just love. So, really, tell us, Yoïn, what is something that you love about Proto-Germanic?
One thing I love is how much it changed on its way to the modern languages, because I, as an historical linguist, love change. For example, let's depart from another language, a language more people will know. It's French. French changed a lot phonologically when we compare it to Latin. And you have a nice metaphor for it.
I do. Yes, I refer to French, specifically Old French, as sort of the meat grinder of Latin, turning the Latin steak into a French sausage. And it's often, almost not recognizable by the end of the process.
Yes, exactly. For example, we have the Latin word Augustus, which was used for the name of the month. It had 3 syllables, Augustus, and it became modern French août. So only one syllable has remained. It is written with 4 letters, A-O-U, with a circumflex and a T, but it's pronounced as one syllable, août. For example, we also have aitaticum, a word for age, and it became the word âge, which gave, or its Old French ancestor, âge, give English age. But aitaticum became âge, one syllable again. If you allow me to give a third example, the Latin word consuetudine, 6 syllables, consuetudine, quite a mouthful. It became consuetumine in popular Latin, and eventually coutume in French. Only 2 syllables remained of these 6 syllables. Now, this is a feature, as you wonderfully call it, a meat grinder. French lost a lot of syllables. I really love this, and I occasionally make fun of it. But actually, the same thing happened with Proto-Germanic on its way to the modern languages. But these examples are well less known, because Proto-Germanic, the knowledge about Proto-Germanic is well less known. Of course, not among linguists, but among the general public. For example, the English word not. It's one syllable. It's a very simple word for negating a sentence. It actually comes from 3 Germanic words, 3 Proto-Germanic words. The first was ne, which was a negation particle. It was the part that made it a negation. Aiwa, which meant ever. It was an adverbial form of the noun I was, which meant eternity. So ne, aiwa. And the last part was wichtan, and this meant thing or creature. It's the ancestor of white, which white with a G and a T, which especially because of the fantasy literature has gotten its own meaning. In Game of Thrones, the whites are special creatures, but it originally is thought to have meant a thing or creature. So ne aiwan wichtan literally meant no thing whatsoever. And this word, or this group of words, I should say, which had 5 syllables, ne aiwan wichtan, eventually became not one syllable. Another example I love, especially because of how its meaning changed, is the word world. It's a compound of the Proto-Germanic word weras, which means man, and it's still found in werewolf, literally a man-wolf, and aldis, which means age, and it's still found in German elte, which also means age, and the obsolete English word eld, which I don't think many people, apart from the dictionary makers, know anymore. So, whereas aldis was combined as weraldis, and it is thought to have meant age of man. So, the age of a human, the lifetime a human is on Earth. And this meaning evolved into lifetime, life on Earth, eventually into this world versus the afterlife. Both the meaning evolved quite a deal from age of man to world, and its form evolved a lot because weraldis became Old English werold with 2 syllables instead of 3, and this became Middle English world or wereld, and eventually world with only 1 syllable. And in many varieties of English we don't even pronounce the R anymore, so world. 3 sounds for a word that started out with 3 syllables. A last example I love is, it doesn't exist anymore in English. It does exist in my native language, Dutch, and in German and many other languages. It's the Dutch word mes, and mes means a knife, and the German counterpart is Messer. Old English had a word for this too. It was metterserks, and metterserks, it shows that there is more to it than just 1 syllable of Dutch mes. It comes from Proto-Germanic mattisachsan, and this was a compound as well from mattis, which is the ancestor of meat, and it is thought to have meant food in general. So the evolution into meat is an English evolution that happened in the course of English. So mattis and sarsan, which meant a short sword or a large knife. It's also where the Saxons got their name from, probably because they wielded these kind of swords. So mattisachsan was literally a food knife, a knife used for cutting food. And it evolved into shorter forms. The last part was dropped in Dutch, and we eventually got mes. Only 1 syllable survived from 4 syllables. So when we look at French again and we call it a meat grinder, we might as well call Dutch or German or English the same meat grinder, but many people don't have the image anymore of the meat it used to be. We only know the sausage anymore.
Yes, fair enough. A good point in defense of French there. What if the Proto-Germanic word, this food knife, what if it had survived in English?
It might have become Messex.
Oh, Messex.
So it would have rhymed with Essex and Wessex.
I was going to say, it sounds like a lost county in England. But yes, fantastic. Okay, Messex, Essex, yes.
Because all these names also contain this word for Saxon from Saxon.
With regret, I have to move our conversation on to the 4th and the final section of every episode, which is really, what is your parting point? What is the thing that you would like to leave the listeners with when it comes to the Proto-Germanic language?
A fact I love is that what helps us in reconstructing the Proto-Germanic language is also evidence from languages that are not Germanic. One of these is Finnish, which stems from Proto-Finnic, and many Proto-Germanic or Proto-Northwest Germanic, so a stage that's a little bit later than Proto-Germanic, many of these words were borrowed into Proto-Finnic, the ancestor of Finnish. And Finnish has been, to some extent, being quite conservative when it comes to sound changes, which means that many of these borrowings from Proto-Germanic, they still reflect the forms we reconstruct for Proto-Germanic better than the actual modern Germanic words. For example, the word for king, which is related to Dutch koning and German König, this word is reconstructed as kuningas. So kuningas, we don't find this anymore in the Germanic languages. But if we look at Finnish, we have kuningas. So it still has an ending, as. It's not us, but us, a very slight change. But it still has 3 syllables, kuningas. If we look at the word for rain, which is reconstructed as ringas, or earlier rengas, we find it in Finnish as rengas. And we could go on and on with examples. A last example may be the word for a lamb, the little sheep. We have Proto-Germanic lambas, and we have Finnish lammas. Of course, some things changed. Every language undergoes changes, and Finnish changed in its own way. But in many words, it conserves the amount of syllables, the Proto-Germanic endings, some of its sounds. In some ways, it confirms what is reconstructed with the comparative method. These reconstructions are confirmed, are reflected by the Finnish forms. And I think that's very neat.
It really is. This is a superb fact to end on for so many reasons. I mean, it is just a treat to work towards these goals and then to have your reconstructions confirmed by a completely different language and a completely different language family. There's no connection whatsoever. And then to find these very old words like those flies, those insects from long ago that are preserved in amber. You know, that's kind of how it feels. These multiple syllables, these endings, and there they are, still to this day in Finnish. And they're not used as endings in Finnish, right? They are treated like just part of the word, which I think you could dig into that too. At least at an earlier point in time, not in Finnish today, but in Proto-Finnic, they're borrowing these words whole. They're not interpreting the ending, as a thing that can be changed for the grammatical function of that word, which, I mean, you could read more into that. You could, at a guess, it says to me that they understand what the words mean, but they don't understand them to the extent that they know what's grammatical and what's the meaningful part of the word. Fascinating stuff, and yet another prehistoric connection between peoples, between speakers. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Celtic connections, the Slavic connections, and now the Finnic connections as well. It's wonderful. I love it. Really, I think that's all I have to say, apart from one final thing, which is just, Yoïn, thank you so much. This has been a real treat to hear you fully and to hear your voice, not just to appreciate your work and your knowledge through your wonderful infographics. If people would like to get in touch, we mentioned at the beginning, but please, could you tell us again, where should people go to check out your amazing work?
First of all, I would like to thank you as well. It was a treat to me too. I loved this talk. I loved speaking with you about our passions. So thank you very much for having me. People can find me on different websites, on Twitter, as I still like to call it. It's X. On Blue Sky, Tumblr, Facebook. And they will find me using one of 2 names. Either Yoïn van Spijk, which is spelled Y-V-A-N-S-P-I-J-K. It's my first name and my surname combined. Or as Taal aan de wandel, which means in Dutch language on the move. So Taal aan de wandel. If you look up these things, if you look up my name on the internet, you will find me. And I will be pleased to welcome you.
As Yoïn can tell you, studying the early history of the Germanic languages involves a lot of input from Latin. as Roman words, things, and ideas crossed the northern frontier and passed into Germanic. These include such everyday words as cheese, an early borrowing from Latin caseus. However, sometimes words went in the opposite direction. Some Germanic words were adopted into later Latin, and a few gained widespread usage. A good example is soap. The English word soap is of Germanic origin. Following the same development of sounds in Yoïn's example of stone, soap goes back to Old English sape, and before that to a possible Proto Germanic word like saipon. The modern German descendant is Seife. Using early soap seems to have been a pretty distinctive feature of Germanic-speaking cultures, since it was commented on by Roman writers. The substance sapor is mentioned by Pliny the Elder and the poet Martial, according to whom sapor not only served to clean things, but also as a hair dye. From this borrowing, modern-day Romance languages get their words for soap, like French savon, Spanish jabón, Romanian sapun, Catalan sapo, and Portuguese sabão. From this Latin and Romance usage, the word went even further. It passed into Arabic as sabun, and then into Persian, and from Persian into various languages of India, such as Hindi Urdu, in which the word for soap is sabun. It reached Swahili, Kazakh, and Kurdish, and via the connections of the Portuguese travelled even further into Malay, Thai, and Tagalog in the Philippines. In Hokkien, spoken on the southeast coast of China and in Taiwan, the word for soap is sabun. As words go, soap has been enormously adventurous, perhaps the most successful Germanic word. That's everything for this episode of A Language I Love Is. If you've enjoyed this episode, again, please do consider subscribing and giving the show a rating wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please do recommend the show widely and go check out Yoïn's excellent online content. My thanks must go to my great guest today, Yoïn van Spijk, and also to you, dear listener, for listening. Keep well and keep loving language.